All right, let's do it. Let's do this.
Let's do it.
All right. Welcome to the 17:6 podcast, where we help you turn the world upside down by the lordship of Christ. I am Trevor.
I am Caleb.
I am Zach.
All right. Well, another episode. Caleb, nice to have you with us again.
Yeah. I was here 30 minutes ago
Yeah.
for the last one we recorded.
Yeah. I think it went a little longer than 30 minutes, but I see what you're saying.
You know what I mean.
Yeah.
45
Whatever
minutes.
the case is, it's nice. It's nice.
I
All
was,
right.
I was here at 6:30 a.m.
You were. It's impressive. So, let's hear your joke.
Oh, that's a horrible setup.
You're welcome.
Zach, I'm reading a book about anti-gravity right now. It's impossible to put down.
That's funny.
You'll be in laugh.
I smiled.
Trevor's done.
That was it.
You didn't like that one at all?
Listen,
It was so bad that he got up.
Listen, I have a character that I have to play during that
know.
section,
I know.
and I'm trying to really commit to that character.
I know.
Okay. Deadpan. That's what we call him.
You know what? There just needs to be a camera devoted to Trevor's face while I tell the joke, because eventually I'm going to get him to break character, and there it is right there. And I'm gonna get him.
All right.
That is my, you know what?
It's your goal in life?
My goal in life right now.
All right.
One of my goals in life right now. Anyways,
Where are
So-
we at? Moses and the bulrushes.
Moses and the bulrushes. Yes. Jesus in prayer. So this morning we were talking about Psalm 110. And Zach, you may be asking, why are we talking about Psalm 110?
That's exactly what I was asking.
Well, Trevor, you was thinking the same thing.
I was.
Because it was referenced in Acts 2 toward the end, or verse 34 through 35 of Acts 2. It references Psalm 110, correct?
Correct. Amanda.
And one thing that's interesting about Psalm 110 that Trevor pointed out is that Psalm 110 is the most quoted Old Testament text in the New Testament.
Must be important.
It must be important for it to be quoted that many times. Do you know how many times it's quoted off the top of your head?
Dang it. No.
It's really difficult to count
Should have done your research.
because
I didn't know we were doing this topic until I walked in. You're like, hey, we're doing Psalm 110.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
but any reference to Christ being seated at God's right hand is a reference to Psalm 110.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times it's worded a little bit differently. So it's
Yeah.
really difficult to count how many times it's referenced or alluded to.
More than 2 hands worth.
So more than 10 times.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
All right.
Definitely that.
So that's why we're looking at it. Well, one of the reasons why we're looking at it, mainly because it's quoted in Acts chapter 2, and might as well figure that out.
And
We probably talked about this psalm a lot, though, in previous episodes,
yeah,
if I know us.
Yeah.
we have.
Okay.
So who wants to kick us off?
That's a good question.
Trevor? Or
No,
I
Zach.
just have one
Yeah.
comment to
Oh,
make,
Zach.
Yeah.
kind of jumping into it. So the overall idea of Psalm 110 is that the Christ is going to be king and priest. We see that in other characters, like Abraham is also a king and a priest. But most of Israel's history, there's kings and there are priests. So it's just the fact that the priest is more of a service role. They're cleaning the temple, upkeeping with it, and serving the people and that kind of thing. So for this king to also be a priest shows that just with those two roles combined, it's it's servant leadership. It is a king. It's a leader for sure. I'm not trying to downplay that, but it's a service. It's a serving king as well.
Yeah, I'm not going to probably remember this exact. I can't get there fast enough. And Zach, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't Zechariah allude to this, talking about kind of the branch kind of going into one to a priest king. This is something alluded to in the Old Testament. If you don't know, that's fine.
I don't know off the top of my head, but you're probably right.
right,
You're
all
usually right, so it's probably correct.
Yeah.
I just don't know Zechariah well enough.
Okay. Well, you're named after the book.
It's a shame. It's a shame.
Wow.
Ironic.
Oh well. Yeah, someone can go look that up. This is alluded to, this priest king position.
Yeah. That was the only introductory comment I wanted to make.
All right. So David did write this, by the way. Just throwing that out there.
Yes. We know that because
of the heading. It says that a Psalm of David.
Psalm of David.
which is confirmed by Jesus,
Yes,
Matthew 22.
that is right. So it is quoted. Yeah, Jesus does talk about this psalm in Matthew 22. He is talking to the Pharisees and asks them this question. Well, who is this Lord that Yahweh says to my Lord, set at my right hand? You tell me that. You tell me that. So Jesus quotes this psalm. Must be super important then.
Right.
And I find, we'll probably get in this later, I find how Paul uses it in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 25-ish, is very, very nice. Because it lays out a plan of really the end of times. And I know we all love talking about eschatology.
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 So we talked about ecclesiology in the last episode. Now we're talking about, well, it may not be the last as far as when it's released, but the last one we recorded.
Right.
So now we're on eschatology.
Eschatology means, Trevor?
The end of times, the end of things.
Okay. So people have different views on different eschatological views.
Oh my goodness, good job. Yeah.
Thank you.
That was so good. I don't know if I could have said it.
That was good.
Yeah. Yes, that is correct. Okay. Well, I'm going to let Zach start with verse 1, and I'm going to jump in, unless Caleb, you do. Unless you have anything you want to
No, go right ahead.
Okay.
All right, verse 1. So, and this is fairly common knowledge. Let's go ahead and cover the basics. So it starts off with a Psalm of David. We talked about that already. And the Lord. The Lord there, Lord is in all caps. Whenever you see the Lord in all caps, that is a reference to the divine name of God, which is Yahweh. And this is one of those passages that's really helpful to distinguish between, well, to actually use the divine name, because it says right next to it, so the Lord says to my Lord, but the second Lord is not in all caps.
Right.
And that's going to be used throughout this psalm, both all caps Lord and not all caps Lord. And just because we want to make it easy to understand, I think we probably ought to talk about Yahweh says to my Adonai, or my Lord, just to make it clear on who's being referenced here. So that's how we're going to proceed, right?
Right.
Okay.
No, that's correct. So, hey, look at that. I turned right to it. So not only is this the divine name of God, Yahweh, it's also a covenant name. So this is a name that God shares and lets his people know, this is what you are to know me by. This is what you are to call me. And we see that in Exodus chapter 3. Is it 15? Oh my goodness. Yep. Look at that. 3:14, 3:15. There it is right there. So if you're wondering how we came to this conclusion, look in Exodus at the burning bush section, and you'll see Yahweh give his covenant name, tell his covenant name to Moses.
Very good. All right. So Yahweh says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Super, super important verse. So what we find out in the New Testament is that this my Lord, the lowercase, the Adonai, is a reference to Christ. And that's how it is consistently applied throughout the New Testament. In Jewish commentary and Jewish scholars, that kind of thing, there's debate on who this is about. Is it about David? Is it about Abraham? Who is it about? But the New Testament gives its commentary on it. And if you're a Christian, you're going to go with the New Testament commentary, which says this is definitely about the Christ.
Yeah.
So the Christ is seated at God's right hand. So that's in heaven. That's a reference to the ascension, which we see in Acts 1:9-ish, somewhere in there. And what we see is that he is at God's right hand. And here's the first big theological point, especially eschatological point I want to make. Until I make your enemies your footstool. So sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool.
So the implications of this is that Christ's enemies, the Messiah's enemies, Jesus' enemies, are being made a footstool. So they are currently in time, because we know that Christ has fulfilled this, Jesus has fulfilled this. They are being made a footstool now.
Yes.
Okay.
And we know that that is going to continue to happen until,
All of them.
yeah, all of them. So the big word there is until. So a lot of people's view on eschatology is that when he comes back, that's when his enemies will be made a footstool.
Yeah.
But as we are reading this verse, it's not he comes back to make his enemies his footstool. Instead, he is in heaven while his enemies are made a footstool, and then he comes back.
Right.
And this seems to be confirmed in Paul's.
Yes,
You're from
I'm-
there?
I'm right there.
In Paul's use in 1 Corinthians 15.
Yeah, so in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 25, it says, "For he," meaning Jesus, "must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death." So, yeah, he's reigning until death has been defeated.
Right.
Yeah.
And the death is defeated at the resurrection of the dead.
Yes.
So that's our view on things. So what that in the theological term for this is post millennialism, which is that's all. I don't like the term, but that's what's been ascribed to
Yeah.
our view. But the idea is we should be seeing victory now as his enemies are being subdued.
Right.
So a lot of people would maybe look at the world and say, how could you take that view when things just are currently taking a nosedive? Maybe. Do you have any
I do have a response to that.
response to that? Okay.
Yeah, my response is, and I'm just going to steal this from Douglas Wilson, but if you got to choose, got to hop in a time machine and decide where you're going to plant yourself in all of human history, where you go to plant yourself, more than likely you're going to say in recent times. Like if you had to, have some dental work done or something like that, where are you going? You probably want to stay in modern times. But even morally, there are a lot of problems with society. We're not saying that everything right now is a perfect utopia and that kind of thing. So think about some of the video games that the kids play nowadays, all the violence and the movies they watch and that kind of thing. Keep in
Sounds
mind,
so old.
I know, keep in mind that 2,000 years ago, they weren't watching movies of this or playing video games. They were going to the Coliseum and literally watching real life humans kill each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that even spiritually, his enemies have been put under his feet. So think of like Gnosticism, this heresy that was creeping into the church. Like it's been defeated. Like these other religions, if you will, their ideologies are being defeated now. It's slowly, it's not overnight by any means. So I don't want to just say only because society is more comfortable, that means his enemies are being put under his feet. And I know that's not what you're saying, but I just didn't want people to get that. It's also look at the world at large. Don't just look at the here and now, look at time. Our kids sing this Timeline song in school and in our homeschool. And I listen to it and I listen to them sing it. And it's just amazing how far we've come. And we get to the Jesus, the Messiah part, kind of I don't know if it's the middle of the song, but things start to go up. Now there's down times for sure, but you start seeing the enemies of God start like being defeated. And I'm not saying America is the good guys by any means. I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
But it's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, paganism was so much more prevalent before Christ.
Right.
And people forget that. Like it was normal for, the pagan worship and sacrifice, human sacrifices, that kind of thing.
Let's talk about the Vikings. Just like, so that brought
a great example.
Yeah. The Vikings are no more because they converted to Christianity.
Yeah.
Like Christianity overtook their pagan religion. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have to look at the entire scope of history.
Absolutely. That
not
is good perspective.
having a narrow view of this is what's going on in my world. So things are horrible.
Every generation will say, this is the worst it's ever been because they're in it.
Yeah.
It's bad right now for us. Correct. Yeah. But over the scope of human history, this is nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So over the last 120, 150 years, it's gone downward in our specific culture. But look at the Southern Hemisphere.
Yeah.
A lot of areas it's gotten better. Not all of them, obviously. But I mean, look at Africa 150 years ago versus where it's at now. Like, they're doing a lot better than they were.
Yes.
So.
And you've been there. So like you've got like on the ground experience.
When I went to Uganda, it was Christianity everywhere. I mean, there's all the shops were named Christian names and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's definitely looking better in a lot of places.
Yeah. So verse 2,
Yeah.
or was that all you had on verse 1?
I think so.
Okay.
That's all I had.
That's all I had as well.
Verse 2.
Oh, hang on. Sorry. I'm very sorry. I do have a note that I just wrote in. So it may be confusing where it says, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. And we're saying Jesus is conquering his people, but it looks like maybe Yahweh is saying, hey, sit here until I make it. So how's this working? Is it Yahweh God, or is it the Messiah Jesus? I'm going to take my point from Psalm 2. Psalm 2 shows that Yahweh is handing the nations over to his Messiah. So it is, yes, Yahweh is conquering through his Messiah, and we're going to find out here in a moment that the Messiah, who is Jesus, is using his people.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
Sorry, verse 2.
All right. Who's reading it? You're reading it?
I can read it.
All right.
Yeah.
The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies.
This is a neat verse. Okay, so Yahweh sends forth from Zion. So sometimes we will think about Christ's rule, and we'll say that Christ rules in heaven. And it's better to say that he rules from heaven, not in heaven, because what we see is that rule is going out from Zion, which historically that's where it started, right?
Exactly.
He was
Zion, another name for Jerusalem.
Yeah,
Okay.
yep. So not only is he crowned in Jerusalem, but also the Spirit is poured out from Jerusalem, and it goes out from there. So his rule is expanding from Jerusalem, or from Zion. The mighty scepter, and I don't know how to nuance this just right, but I think there's some level of how this is fulfilled is not in a like physical sense, because of the fact that it talks about his mighty scepter, and what we see in Acts 2 is like his Holy Spirit, so it is happening in the physical material world, but it's not with a like mighty scepter. You know what I'm saying? So the mighty scepter stands for something, which I think that is a perfectly acceptable interpretation of the scepter.
Yeah.
And then it says, rule in the midst of your enemies. So we see that in Acts as this is fulfilled. Acts 1:8 opens up with power will come on you.
Yeah.
And power, rule, they are not interchangeable terms, but they're coupled. They go together. And that's what we see happening. One thing I want to point out is that it says rule in the midst of your enemies, which even here in Psalm 110 in the Old Testament, we're seeing indications that Christ's rule, Christ's kingdom, is going to have a now, not yet, or already not yet application. Meaning it's not just a black and white. He's not ruling, then, change the curtain. Now he is ruling.
Right.
But he's ruling in the midst of his enemies.
Yeah. Just because people don't think Christ is ruling or would not say Christ is king doesn't make that true. Like Christ is king.
He's still going to have enemies.
Right. Exactly. You can kind of see that in Psalm 2 again, referencing Psalm 2. Like you have I know this was referencing the Gentiles, and Paul or Peter explains this is the Gentiles and Herod, but you have the pagans and the kings and the rulers of the world trying to break the bonds of Yahweh's plan. So kind of like, but they're not going to break it. So anyway, that's what I'm just saying. Yeah.
So the victory is not without resistance.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And I think the main application from that is it should boost our confidence.
Absolutely.
Like we should have a lot of confidence in Christ's reign.
Yeah.
Even while there are enemies, he's ruling in the midst of that. So we should not have a defeatist mentality or a fatalistic mentality, but rather we should be coming from a standpoint of Christ has won the victory, and he's extending that victory now.
Yeah. So you may be thinking, well, doesn't it, we can't have a defeatist mentality. Yeah, we know that, but you guys are saying the kingdom of God's advancing, but we know that but we read in the Gospels that the gates of hell won't overtake the church, but it seems like the gates of hell is the one that's advancing. But I'd have to ask you, you're thinking about that the wrong way. Gates are a defensive mechanism, not an offensive mechanism. It's the church who's on the offense. So this still aligns with what we read in the Gospels about that. So,
yeah. And there's a whole thing with the whole the Great Tribulation, and I don't think we should go into that right now, but just know that has been considered in our understanding of things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay.
Verse 3.
Verse 3. Your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power. In holy garments from the womb of the morning, the dew of your youth will be yours. So yeah, we follow. So you may have a different interpretation of this, Zach. So let's talk about that. We follow our King in righteousness, bought by our King. So your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power. That's kind of what we're doing. We are following our King, like with no hesitancy.
Right. The offer themselves right there. That I wonder if Paul is thinking of that in Romans 12 when he says to offer yourself as a living sacrifice.
Yeah.
I wonder if he has this in mind, because that's the language that's being used right now. When you offer an animal sacrifice, it's a sacrifice, but we are offering ourselves like living sacrifices. Like, yeah, we're a burnt offering that's just being used for however it pleases Yahweh.
Yeah. And we take delight in that.
Right.
Like, joyful.
So it kind of goes back to the whole, like, we are not our own. We've been bought with a price.
Right.
So, David Platt talks about the idea of like, I'm handing God a blank check, just write whatever needs to be done on there and send it.
David Platt.
Yeah.
Second reference of him in our podcast.
I read a book by David Platt last week. Counterculture.
Wow. Okay.
It was good.
Cool.
Yeah. That's why he's on my mind.
No, it's
but
fun.
yeah.
It's
Okay.
fun.
You have anything else?
That's all I have on that section. Do you have anything on that section? Because I can take a stab at what from the womb of your morning means.
Let's go back just a little bit.
Go for it.
Actually, I'm sorry. Two more things. So we see the idea of like, because it's your people offer themselves freely on the day of your power. We already see this idea of like Christ being the head who's ruling from God's right hand, and his people being his body. So we're going to see this more throughout the rest of the psalm, but the idea that he is doing things, but it's through the agency of his people.
Right.
And we see that started here in verse 3. That'll be fleshed out more in verses 5 through 7, but we'll just kind of make that comment now. It does say on the day of his power, in holy garments. And I think that can be pretty significant. That might be part of where Paul comes from with the whole Ephesians 6:12, you fight not against flesh and blood, because you would think that, and this is how a lot of the Jews in the first century were expecting Messiah to come, was for there to be like a violent overthrow. Right. And what we see instead is that his people are offering themselves freely on the day of his power, but it's in holy garments. It's not in armor and swords. So that the kingdom is being advanced by holy garments, priests, not warriors.
Right.
And this is where I think Psalm 110 like so clearly lays out what Jesus was going to be doing with the whole now not yet picture of what's presented and the holy garments thing.
Yeah, physical conquering will happen, but it's through this. It's through the spirit, through spiritual things. So you will see God's enemies overthrown and defeated, but it's through the spirit, not through physical advancement.
Right, and it's really difficult because we don't want to go. This is what you're doing. You're trying to guard against, like, we don't want to make everything all spiritual, and we're just kind of Gnostics. We're not wanting to say that, but we're just trying to say it's not a violent overthrow.
Right. Exactly.
All right. So from the womb of the morning, the dew of your youth will be yours. And this is probably the most important verse in the Bible.
Yeah.
And it'll really encourage you. And I'm going to let Trevor take it from there.
Yeah, it is. It is super important. And you should take heed to what I'm about ready to say. I'm going to take a stab at what this even means. I don't know.
That'll be good.
So the Hebrew behind this is very obscure, and they're really unsure. There's like two ways to translate this, but I'm going with the ESV, and I think most Bible translations translate it like that. So here's my stab. As one feels strength when they rise in the morning in their youth. So think about when you were young and you felt strong every time you woke up. I remember just this morning, my kid wakes up, he bounced out of bed 1,000 miles an hour. I'm like, what? This is at 5:30 in the morning, and he's ready to take on the world. So I'm thinking that is the strength you will have. So it's just refreshing. Every morning you'll be refreshed. That's my stab.
Sounds good to me, bro.
Okay.
I love it.
Great.
All right, verse 4.
Let's do it. Verse 4.
Caleb,
You got
you want to
that?
do it?
Yeah. The
Okay.
Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek.
It's fantastic. And we all know who Melchizedek is, so we can just skip that. But the Lord, once this takes effect, it's not going to be revoked. Like the Lord's put it in motion. There's no turning back now. Jesus is king. Sorry about you. So yeah.
So this it points to the fact that God is immutable.
Yeah.
He's not changing. He's the same. And I think that goes back to the whole, we have a lot of confidence.
Absolutely.
Especially contrasted with a lot of the pagan gods that he has defeated, which were led by their emotions and, one way one day and different the other day. We see that contrast between those pagan gods and how Yahweh is, who is steadfast and unchanging,
Yeah. And
immutable.
so this Melchizedek, I think, is another pointer to this priest king that you talked about at the beginning of this episode, because that's what Melchizedek was. He
Right,
was
yeah.
a king, priest king, whatever,
Right.
of Salem. If you want to know where that's at, Genesis 14, 18 through 20, Abraham goes, I believe, and saves Lot. He's coming back, and this king that's also a priest from Salem comes out, and his name's Melchizedek. He just enters the picture. Abraham gives him 10% of what he got, and Melchizedek leaves.
Yeah.
We hear from him in Psalm 110 about him, and then again in Hebrews.
Yeah. I was going to mention that the point that Hebrews makes from this verse. So we talked about how often this psalm is quoted in the New Testament. Hebrews alone quotes it like over a dozen times.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Like he lingers on this one. It's almost primarily on this verse right here. And what the author of Hebrews, the point that he's trying to make is that right here, since we know that in the future from Psalm 110's viewpoint, from the future, there's going to be a Melchizedekian priesthood, or however you say
Great.
that.
No, that was so good.
However you pronounce that. It shows the
New word.
Why is that not our podcast name?
Melchizedek.
Melchizedekian podcast. Okay.
But it shows the inadequacy of the Levitical priesthood. It shows that it was never meant to be permanent, but it was going to be done away with, and we're going to have a different priesthood instead. So I think a lot of times Christians will be thankful that in the New Testament, we don't have to deal with sacrifices and the priesthood and all that stuff. And that's just not true. The priesthood has been changed out, but we still have a sacrifice and we still have a priest.
That's right.
It's just
Yeah,
it's just a superior priesthood.
exactly.
But yeah, we are still in the sacrifices and priesthood age. It's just
Man,
been accomplished.
It's
already.
such a good point, because when I thought about that kind of just blew my mind. Nothing's changed in the sacrifice way like that, but it's just been fulfilled and done away, or not done away, but it's just done. It's
Yeah,
just
it's
fulfilled.
accomplished.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's accomplished.
fulfilled.
Yeah.
But Hebrews is this is just a foreshadow to Hebrews, and I don't think the author of Hebrews is inventing anything new. He's just working this out logically.
Yeah. Absolutely.
There can be no greater sacrifice than the sacrifice that
Yeah.
Yeah.
has already been given.
Exactly.
Yep. So with that being said, God is still hates sin,
Yeah.
and he still needed some sacrifice for sin. So that's all the point that we're trying to make right now.
All right. So now that we know exactly who Melchizedek is and exactly what this is talking about, let's go to verse 5. And do you want to just do 5 through 7, or do you want to just do it verse by verse? What do you got?
Let's do it all together. I think it
Okay.
all goes together
I
really
agree.
well.
Caleb.
The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings on the day of his wrath. He will execute judgment among the nations, filling them with corpses. He will shatter chiefs over the wide earth. He will drink from the brook by the way, therefore he will lift up his head.
Triumphant conqueror. Yeah.
All right, so in verse 5, we see the Lord again, and that's in lowercase letters. So that's a reference to Christ, not Yahweh. So back in verse 4, we saw Lord in all caps. That was Yahweh. Verse 5, it's the Christ. And he's still at your right hand. So he's still at Yahweh's right hand in verse 5. Which means that we have to work out how. So that's the first line of verse 5. The second line of verse 5 is he, meaning the Lord, who is presently at God's right hand, will shatter kings on the day of his wrath.
Right.
So however he is shattering kings, he's not physically present for, because he's still at God's right hand.
Exactly. And this could be where you get confused, because you're like, well, I thought Yahweh was the one making his enemies his footstool, but now I'm reading that he's shattering kings, but he's at the right hand of God the Father. So yeah, Psalm 2 informs really Psalm 110.
Yeah. And I think verse 3 informs verse 5,
Yeah.
which is, again, we're just seeing this idea of agency. So
Right.
Christ as Yahweh's agent and Christ's people as Christ's agents.
Exactly.
So he's shattering kings on the day of his wrath. And one question I had was, in Psalm 110, why is he shattering them? And I think maybe we had to go back to Psalm 2 to answer that question. I don't know. Have you thought how to answer that?
I have not thought about how to answer that.
Okay, because usually, well, I say usually, a lot of times there will be some indication on why the wrath is coming upon them.
Okay.
And in Psalm 110, it's just assumed that you know why
That's a good point.
the kings, the nations, and the chiefs are receiving Christ's wrath.
All right. Well, let me see if I can find it. Oh, okay. Now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth, serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all those who take refuge in him.
And I was thinking back up to verse 1, or verses 1 and 2, whatever that is.
Yeah. So why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth, this is all Psalm 2. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds and do our own thing. Yeah.
So you see the nations and kings and rulers / chiefs plotting against Yahweh and his anointed in Psalm 2. And then here in Psalm 110, you see Yahweh using the agency of the Christ, using the agency of the church to shatter the kings.
Right. Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to point out in verse 6 was, so he will execute judgment among the nations. One thing that I hear a lot of times is we can't hold non-Christians accountable to Christian standards.
So that means Christ isn't king.
Right. So we see the exact opposite of that being done here.
Right.
Like the nations
Right.
are being held to Christ's standard.
Exactly.
Because again, back to Psalm 2, the nations have been given to Christ. They
Exactly.
belong to him. Like America presently, right now, in the year of our Lord, 2024, the year of our Lord kind of tells us something right there, but belongs to Christ. Therefore, he has every right to demand that Joseph Biden or Donald Trump or Kamala Harris submits to. And I guess we should mention that this is being recorded before the election, so I don't know who's going to end up in office.
Yeah.
But
Wow.
yeah, but they owe their allegiance to Christ, and to be rejecting his standard and rejecting his law would be treason to their king.
Yeah.
So that's the idea here, and we just see that like they're being held accountable. If we know for sure they're going to be held accountable on the day of judgment, why would we not then hold them accountable now?
Yeah. Exactly.
Another thing I was going to point out is this uses a lot of seemingly violent language. So
It's wonderful.
they're shattering kings, filling the nations with corpses, shattering chiefs. And I think another maybe way to think through this is it's not that the church is his only agency.
Right.
We see all over the place. He uses natural disasters. He uses pagan, wicked nations as agency as well.
Well, I mean, Romans 13 says that the government is his sword. Like it's to use the sword for justice. So it's another agency.
So what we don't see is the church taking up arms and attacking pagan nations.
Sorry, I said government. I mean civil government when I say government.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're trying to get out of the habit of thinking that the only form of government is civil, because there's also family government, church government,
self-government.
Yeah. But our language is still we're trying to get that fixed still.
We're trying to reform.
Yeah. But the church government is not the one that wields swords and goes and attacks Christ's enemies. our enemy is not flesh and blood, right?
That's right.
So, but this can be done in a literal physical sense through, like I said, natural disasters and even wicked nations. He raises up Babylon to accomplish his purpose,
right,
in Persia and that kind of thing.
And through holy nations, if you will, through Christian nations. So I think that is one piece, as a Christian, something that we need to think through is the offices that God has put together. Like the government is a separate office than the church. The church isn't going to be waging war against some physical enemy. That's not the church's position. But there is something that was created, the civil government. God has instituted that. And so when Christians get in there and they say, sorry, this is a long rant, but I do want us to think in depth about this. So when Christians do get into office and they are told that they have the sword to enact justice upon wicked people, they do that in a holy way, in a righteous way, because they know what is good and bad. We have a whole book dedicated to that. So, yeah, there is ways that we can do that physically.
All right, verse 7. Do you have anything else on?
I know that was good.
Okay, verse 7. He will drink from the brook by the way, which kind of the idea there is that he's like on the move. He's not just chilling. He's like on the way. He's going and he's drinking from the brook, so being nourished. And most of the commentaries I read on this, like this is like a spiritual nourishment. I don't know. I don't have a whole lot of thoughts on this, but therefore he will lift up his head is how the psalm ends. And again, that goes back to the whole, like, there's a lot of confidence. This
victory.
This psalm is a victorious psalm. It's meant to give you some, in the most holy way, some swagger,
Yeah. When you see that, lifting up the horns in triumph, like that means there's just victory. Like lifting up his head, there's victory there.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, that's all I got.
That's all I have as well.
One thing I wanted to kind of summarize on this is that I think it's interesting that I think even David, this was written by David, but even David probably knew that its fulfillment was in Christ.
Yeah, I would.
Right?
I would think so. I when he was inspired to write this, however that worked, I'm pretty sure he knew this wasn't about him.
And I think that's how we can take the view of this is the long, like this wasn't fulfilled in David's time whenever he was conquering and God was taking out his enemies. This is a fulfilled by Christ and a future.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would support that by looking at verse 4 about a priest after the order of Melchizedek, because that is like, there's no way that applies to David.
Yeah, and he would know that because he knew that he was just a king.
So if you take David out of it, put Christ into it, kind of like, forgive me if I misquote this or I'm paraphrasing, but in your last sermon on Psalms, you took.
Oh man. Quoting my sermons. That's
well, I'm not quoting your sermon, but you said to take David out of that, and this is about just Christ, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know, just that helps me kind of view it from a different viewpoint of this isn't about David.
Yeah. And when you say long game, you mean thousands and thousands of years.
Could be.
Yeah.
Could be thousands of years.
Yeah. We might just be the early church.
Yeah. Could be.
Okay.
Anyways.
That was great. Well, anything else? I'll close it. Okay, fantastic. Like and subscribe to all of our social media platforms. Comment below. Share it with your friends. Share it with your family. I would love to hear your thoughts specifically on eschatology. Do you think we're heretics for not being dispensationalists or believing in a rapture like that is common when I say rapture? A secret rapture. The tribulation, that type of thing. I don't know. I'm just curious. This is a good conversation because eschatology is a hot topic and it divides a lot of people, but that's not what we're trying to do.
No.
Anyway, all right. Like and subscribe. Thanks for watching the 17:6 podcast, where we help you turn the world upside down by the lordship of Christ.
I didn't slap his microphone that time.
That's wisdom. That's wisdom.
That is wisdom.
It's growth. Getting better.
Yeah.
Hey,